I think this morning's topic certainly is going to be of interest to our audience. It's definitely up there with, I think, one of the great concerns for DoD, along with cyber, which we've talked about at the conference already, and obviously sequestration, always on everyone's mind. With China, I know that that is a big interest, certainly, of the readers of proceedings. It's an interest of mine. We usually have an issue where we have a focus of articles that runs. We'll be doing that in April again this year, and I hope that out of the discussion this morning, perhaps some articles will come from there. To guide us through the discussion this morning is Dr. David Finkelstein, Vice President and Director of China Studies at the Center for Naval Analyses. A retired Army officer, Dr. Finkelstein is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and the Army War College. He received his Ph.D. in Chinese history from Princeton and studied Mandarin at Nankai University in China. He has held China-related positions at the Pentagon and as an advisor to both SecDef and chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He also served on the faculty at West Point, teaching Chinese history, and is a widely published author. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Dr. David Finkelstein, our moderator.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the organizers, AFCEA and Naval Institute, for putting this panel together. As an Army officer at the Center for Naval Analyses, there are some people who consider me a defector and some who consider this a penetration. I'll let you decide which it is. But we're going to have what I think is a lively discussion here on the Chinese Navy. As you know, since the early 1990s, the armed forces of China have been undergoing a transformation no less remarkable than the transformations in the Chinese economy, in Chinese politics, and Chinese society itself. So as we march into the second decade of the 21st century, as the PRC emerges as a global international actor of consequence, it does so for the first time in Chinese history with a military that is increasingly credible in an operational sense and increasingly professional in an institutional sense. And in the span of just a couple of decades, a military that was previously built around ground forces preparing almost exclusively for the continental defense of China proper has now turned to become a nascent joint force which is striving to become more capable of securing China's national interests in the Asia-Pacific region writ large and eventually, slowly, ineluctably, some believe, beyond. So, put another way, today, some segments of the PLA are well into making the transition from being the massive low-tech homeland defense force that it was as late as in the 1980s to today's relatively higher-tech force, a military that is at the incipient stages of operationally regionally. And this is obviously a significant development for the security landscape of the Asia-Pacific region, unprecedented actually, and it naturally raises all sorts of questions, issues, and yes, in some quarters, concerns as well. And the profound nature of this transformation really is underscored by juxtaposing two events in China's military history 30 years apart. 1979, China gets waxed by the People's Army of Vietnam. There wasn't even a naval component to that war. Fast forward to 30 years later, 2009, and a Chinese naval flotilla is off the Horn of Africa conducting anti-piracy operations with other navies, or at least in coordination with them. So today, at the very moment that China is now emerging as this rising power, it does so with a military that at the end of the day is undergoing four significant transformations. First, operationally, for the first time, the PLA Navy is considered a strategic force, not a force to cover the ground forces of potential warfighters on the ground in China. It's a strategic force in its own right. Strategically, the PLA writ large has been told to extend China's strategic depth out to sea. Operationally, the paradigm is shifting from training to fight wars on the continent to fighting high-tech, high-ops tempo wars off the Chinese littoral. And finally, doctrinally, the PLA is transitioning from single-service operational warfighting concepts to joint warfighting concepts that also attempt to integrate cyber, the electronic magnetic spectrum, and outer space as legitimate future battle space dimensions. But clearly, it is the PLA Navy that is currently at the tip of the Chinese spear, so we are incredibly fortunate to have with us today some subject matter experts, an outstanding mix, I would say, of scholars, strategists, and operators as well, who have special expertise in Chinese naval affairs. And I think we're going to learn a lot by listening to what they have to say about the rise of the Chinese Navy. They are, in the order in which they will be speaking, Dr. Jacqueline Deal, who is the President and CEO of Long-Term Strategy Group based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is widely published, often in the media. She's worked with the Office of Net Assessments for many years on East Asian security affairs and technological change and innovation in China. And I'm personally looking forward to hearing how she views the situation. Next on the hit parade of panelists is Captain Jim Fennell, currently the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence and Information Operations at the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and as the top intelligence officer at PAC Fleet, his insights on this topic are clearly unique. And again, I'm looking forward to what he has to say. I would add that Jim has also had experience as a Soviet watcher, so he brings a comparative perspective to his views on the PLA Navy as well. And of course, next, Major Chris Johnson, Marine Corps, currently stationed at the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. He is a veteran of both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, and he's also a Foreign Area Officer for China with the United States Marine Corps. Chris, I might add, was, I believe, the first Marine Corps officer to graduate from Hong Kong University, and he did so as an Olmsted Scholar, so that's terrific, and thanks for your service downrange. Appreciate that. Last but certainly not least in anybody's bibliography of things you must read is the author of Red Star over Asia, Red Star over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy, Dr. Toshi Yoshihara, who currently holds the Van Buren Chair of Asia-Pacific Studies at the Naval War College. He is also associated with the China Maritime Studies Institute up at Newport. He's, again, widely published, always in demand with the media and on the conference circuit. He's been an analyst for many years. He's been with the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, RAND, the American Enterprise Institute, and very well received. All of his work is usually well received. So that's our panel of subject matter experts. I'm going to ask each of them to make opening comments of anywhere from 6 to 8 minutes. Let them get some of their basic ideas and thoughts out into the audience. We'll follow that with back and forth across the table, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So with that, thanks, and Jackie?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dave, for the warm introduction. Thanks to the U.S. Naval Institute and AFC for the invitation to speak here today. It's actually my second appearance at this conference, and I think the trends are positive. The room is bigger and the audience is bigger. Also, it's an honor to speak on a panel with such a distinguished roster of fellow speakers with operational and academic and scholarly expertise and insights. We were asked to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes initially and to address 5 questions. So I normally speak fast, but now I'm going to speak extra fast. I apologize in advance. The 5 questions we were asked to address are: 1, is the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy modernization that we're witnessing currently, a function of capabilities-based or contingency-based planning? Question 1. Question 2, what are the evolving roles and missions of the PLAN that we've witnessed recently? What are the recent developments in the PLAN's roles and missions? 3, how capable is the Chinese Navy as a fighting force? 4, what has been the impact on the region of the Chinese Navy's modernization? And 5 is, what challenges and opportunities does Chinese naval modernization present for the United States? So just in the interest of time, and I'm hoping we can come back to some of these issues in the Q&A, I'm going to take the first 2 questions together. So again, The first question was, is the Chinese naval modernization we've been witnessing a function of capabilities-based or contingency-based planning? And the second question is, what are the recent developments in the evolving roles and missions of the Chinese Navy? So I think the first question is an interesting one because the vocabulary we're using, contingency-based or capabilities-based planning, is obviously our vocabulary, and we're trying to apply it to China to help us understand the modernization of the Chinese Navy. But I'm not sure it works. It's also interesting because I think we China watchers and Chinese Navy watchers have gone from assuming that Chinese Navy developments were a function of contingency-based planning to thinking that Chinese naval developments were a function of contingency-based planning. But I think events in the last few years have probably made at least some of us realize that neither of those categories is adequate and that something else might be going on that's more distinctly Chinese. So in 2000, all of the respectable Chinese experts in the United States would have told you that contingency-based planning was driving Chinese naval modernization, and specifically Taiwan contingency. All of Chinese naval modernization at that time was ascribed to Chinese plans for a recovery of Taiwan or a reaction to Taiwanese independence. And then by the mid-2000s, I think the consensus was what we're witnessing is sort of generic modernization. Yes, the PLA and the PLAN are building up or modernizing, but there isn't a particular contingency or set of contingencies that's driving this set of developments. We're watching a generic buildup of a military, and it's almost a natural phenomenon for a country that's getting rich to invest in its military, its navy, as in the course of its general economic development and modernization. But then in 2004, Hu Jintao, the outgoing leader of the Chinese Communist Party, who's actually just been succeeded, gave an important address in which he outlined, quote, new historic missions for the Chinese military. And this was really, I think, a very important watershed moment, because in addition to the traditional missions of defending the role of the Communist Party and its position within China and defending Chinese territorial sovereignty, he said that the mission of the military was expanded to include defending China's overseas interests and also protecting the period of strategic opportunity for China, or the period in which China's rise has been possible. And that really opens up a whole new set of missions, a much more ambitious, potentially, set of missions for the Chinese military generally and for the Chinese Navy in particular. If you think about the range of Chinese overseas interests today, it extends from not just China's sort of near abroad and the sea lines of communications in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, but also well into the Indian Ocean, into the Middle East. If you consider China's trade relationships with countries in Africa and Latin America, China's overseas interests and the protection of Chinese nationals abroad could lead the Chinese Navy to perceive requirements to defend Chinese interests in the Indian Ocean, in the South Atlantic, so a much broader ambit for the PLAN. So that's a challenging mandate, but this speech was delivered in 2004, and we've seen subsequent references to it. It seems to have sort of achieved a canonical position, this new set of new historic missions for the Chinese military. So with that in mind, I think the sort of capabilities-based or contingency-based planning rubric may not be appropriate. I think it's more appropriate to think about a, frankly, very ambitious Chinese agenda that is perhaps consistent with the role of a rising great power to defend its interests, again, not just in its near abroad, not just the sovereignty of what we think of as the mainland, but also Chinese interests very far afield. And in some ways, you can sort of trace a line from Deng Xiaoping's embarking China on this period of economic growth and modernization in the 80s, and his work with the Admiral Liu Huaqing, who's probably the father of the Chinese Navy's modernization back in the 80s, to this new set of historic missions, again, that was enunciated in 2004. Liu Huaqing, who was Deng's admiral and who is probably the sort of Mahan figure behind China's Navy's rise in the recent period, back in 1982 said, our mission will be by 2000 to 2010 to be able to defend China's interests within the first island chain. So that includes Taiwan, it includes the Okinawa Japanese islands, and it includes out to the Philippines in the south. And then by 2010 to 2020, in this period, we'd like to be able to defend China's interests to the second island chain, and that includes other Japanese islands out to Guam and Indonesia. And then beyond that, from 2020 to 2040, we'd like to be able to defend China's interests in the blue waters. We'd like to be able to challenge the position of the United States and its ascendancy as the dominant naval power in the Pacific. And I think if you sort of look at that blueprint and you look at the new historic missions, you can see that what's driving China's Navy's development is a much more ambitious, great power agenda. So that, I think, takes care of number one. For question number two, the evolving roles and missions, again, I would just say that what we've seen in terms of China's behavior recently seems to be consistent with what Hu Jintao laid out for the Chinese Navy. We've seen a move towards more expeditionary and warfighting capabilities across the PLA, but including in the Chinese Navy, the development of more amphibious assault ships, the development of the aircraft carrier, heavy lift transport capabilities, an increasing Chinese presence in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, and an increasing number of exercises in the blue waters. So Chinese exercises will take place in waters of the Pacific. Chinese naval ships will transit the waters near Taiwan and Japan to get out to the Pacific to do these exercises. Obviously, we've also seen Chinese deployments as part of the anti-piracy missions in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden region. More and more out-of-area experience for Chinese naval vessels, Chinese naval officers. I think it's important to highlight that because it is a temptation in the United States to focus on the capabilities that might directly affect U.S. aircraft carriers, the anti-ship ballistic missile, and other cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that the Chinese have been developing. But there are other developments that are important and that fit in with this larger agenda of being able to, by 2020 to 2040, project power well beyond the second island chain. The third question was how capable is the Chinese Navy as a fighting force? I think that's the $64 million question. There are obviously questions about the quality of Chinese training. Recently, Xi Jinping has said that the Chinese military in general needs to train better for actual war fighting. There are also issues, I think from an American perspective, we wonder how the Chinese will navigate issues of delegation of authority and trust, because the Chinese system is more hierarchical, and in our military we're accustomed to a system where even lower officers, enlisted forces, have a fair amount of discretion and authority, and that seems to be important to modern high-tech warfare. So how will the Chinese Navy handle that? One of the hypotheses is that the Chinese will rely on very well scripted, very well rehearsed in advance, pre-planned sequences of operations, and that may work, but I think a question is, what do we do, or what do other powers do? Do we make it easy for the Chinese by ensuring that they know the shape of their adversaries before they encounter them, such that these well-rehearsed, well-scripted in advance sequences of operations can work? Or do we and other powers put a premium on our own flexibility and changing our shape often so that we're not predictable, or the other powers that China confronts aren't predictable, such that these pre-planned, well-rehearsed sequences of operations won't work? But I think that is, again, the $64 million question, or one of them. Just back in 2006, Hu Jintao did complain that despite what he had said in 2004 about the new historic missions, the Chinese military wasn't yet up to the task. He complained about the two incompatibles. The Chinese military is not capable of fighting and winning high-tech local wars under informationalized conditions, which is the Chinese military's term of art for the current environment. And he also said the Chinese military is not yet up to defending China's overseas interests. Next question was, what has been the impact of Chinese naval modernization on the region? I think it's mixed. Just briefly, I'll say on the one hand, we've seen a lot of procurement by regional countries in response to China's naval modernization. The Philippines just announced that they're going to be buying fighters from South Korea. The Vietnamese have purchased kilos from the Russians. The Indonesians also have been procuring submarines and fighters from Russia and South Korea. The Japanese have been talking about revising the Constitution and expanding at least the number of submarines that are deployed and putting out more Coast Guard forces. The Indians are now practicing, they're developing a nuclear triad, which again doesn't seem aimed at Pakistan, it seems aimed at a China threat. And also the regional countries are reaching out more to the United States and to each other to coordinate and try to preserve a balance as China's military power rises. So that's on one side. On the other side, I think that there is a chance that these other powers will be intimidated by China's rapid military improvements. So I think the verdict is still out on how the region is reacting, and we've seen both evidence of active response and buildup, and also evidence of fear and the potential for succumbing to Chinese coercive pressure now that China is much stronger. So I'm gonna stop there before getting to challenges and opportunities because I'm out of time, but hopefully we can come back to that in the Q&A, and I apologize for taking so long, but they're very important questions.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think you're quite correct to bring up the 2004 new historic missions. Maybe we'll pick up on that on the panel after we get to our speakers' comments.
Thanks, Jackie. And first of all, good morning, everybody. Aloha. I'd like to thank the Institute and AFCEA for inviting me again to speak here at AFCEA West. My last time was speaking here was 2006, and it's hard to believe it's been so long. But my topics are very much similar to what I spoke about. I reviewed my words from 2006, and I'm glad we're speaking about China again, and I think the developments since 2006 are informative to this discussion. I'd also say that maybe after you hear my prepared remarks, you may not want to invite me back because they'll be a little bit more pointed than Jackie's. And I typically am an ad hoc speaker in my current position as a Fleet Intelligence Officer, but I wanted to present some prepared remarks, so I will read, hopefully not bore you. It'll be about 8 minutes. As a Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, I arrive at work every morning around 5 a.m., and by that time my officers will have prepared a book for me outlining the maritime events over the last 24 hours in an area of responsibility that stretches from the west coast of Hawaii to Africa, or as the Fleet Commander Admiral Haney said yesterday, from Hollywood to Bollywood. At 6, I'll take an intelligence briefing surrounded by the best Asian maritime analysts in the world. Submarine specialists, aviation experts, governance specialists, imagery analysts, cryptanalysts, and linguists. Over 24 of us as we probe the very latest intelligence in each other with questions and observations from 45 minutes to an hour every day. All countries are included in this analysis: Japan, Russia, North Korea, India, Southeast Asia. We cover all the bases event by event. That being said, every day it's about China. It's about a China who is at the center of virtually every activity and dispute in the maritime domain in the East Asian region. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLA Navy, is now regularly operating in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and maintains a robust, constant presence throughout the East and South China Seas, what the Chinese call their near seas. In fact, over the last 5 years, the PLA Navy has moved out beyond the first island chain into the Philippine Sea, or what they would call the distant seas. These moves into the distant seas would seem inevitable for a nation as large as China's. But it goes without saying that this expansion into the blue waters are largely about countering the U.S. Pacific Fleet. If afforded the time, we could spend the next several hours or days discussing specific platforms, naval armaments, and training that drives me to make this assessment. Suffice it to say, my assessment is the PLA Navy has become a very capable fighting force. Much of the intelligence record is classified beyond what we can discuss in this forum, but just to give you one example, in 2012, the PLA Navy sent 7 surface action groups and the largest number of its submarines on deployment into the Philippine Sea in its history, and a significant increase in some areas from the years before, just the year before. But as Admiral Haney likes to remind me, it's not just about bean counting that matters. It's about what they're doing when they go to sea. And I can tell you, as the Fleet Intelligence Officer, the PLA Navy is going to sea to learn how to do naval warfare. or as the PRC State News Organization Xinhua stated yesterday, as their first surface action group of 2013 deployed just 2 days ago into the Philippine Sea. They said, the fleet will carry out more than 20 types of exercises, including naval confrontation, battle drills far out to sea, the protection of maritime rights, and command and control. Make no mistake, the PRC Navy is focused on war at sea and about sinking an opposing fleet. The PLA's Navy Civil Proxy, an organization called China Marine Surveillance, has escalated a focus campaign since 2008 to gain Chinese control of the near seas. And they now regularly challenge the exclusive economic zone resource rights that South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and Vietnam once thought were guaranteed to them by the United Nations Convention Law on the Sea. If you map out their harassments, you will see they form a curved front that has over time expanded out against the coasts of China's neighbors, becoming the infamous 9-dash line, plus the entire East China Sea. To put it another way, we do not see incidents or controversies around Chinese platforms off the coast of Guangzhou or Shanghai. No, China is negotiating for control of other nations' resources off their coasts. What's mine is mine, and we'll negotiate what's yours. China now has 8 military installations on 7 reefs in the Spratlys, including one they seized 115 miles off the Philippine coast. And China Marine surveillance cutters now regularly patrol the entire region. Incidentally, unlike U.S. Coast Guard cutters, China Marine surveillance cutters have no other mission but to harass other nations into submitting to China's expansive claims. Mundane maritime government tasks like search and rescue, regulating fisheries, ice-breaking, and criminal law enforcement are handled by other agencies. China Marine Surveillance is a full-time maritime sovereignty harassment organization, and they are still building their large cutters at an astonishing rate. By their own count, China Marine Surveillance tripled their patrols in the South China Sea since 2008. I've just used the words expand and expansive, and I know that it's controversial for some in this room. And it even feeds the caricature of a Department of Defense promotion of a quote-unquote China threat theory. But for those of us who have watched this on a daily basis over the last decade, there is no better description for what China has been doing. The People's Republic of China's presence in the southern China Sea prior to 1988 was nearly zero. Now in 2013, they literally dominate it. They are taking control of maritime areas that have never before been administered or controlled in the last 5,000 years by any regime called China. And the PRC is now doing it in an area up to 900 miles from the mainland, up to dozens of miles off the coast of other nations. In my opinion, China is knowingly, operationally, and incrementally seizing maritime rights of its neighbors under the rubric of a maritime history that is not only contested in the international community, but has largely been fabricated by Chinese government propaganda bureaus in order to, quote-unquote, educate the populace about China's rich maritime history, clearly as a tool to sustain the party's control. Last year's Scarborough Shoal seizure exemplifies the confrontation China is having with its neighbors. It's one that exhibited all the common characteristics of China's aggression. First, they are initiated by the egregious conduct of China's actors, sometimes the Chinese government, sometimes private entities. At Scarborough Reef, Chinese fishermen were excavating live coral and harvesting endangered species, including giant clams. Second, Chinese official spokesmen will issue a fabricated story to explain the incident. In the case of Scarborough, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman said Chinese fishermen were seeking refuge from storms. Simply not true. You can Google the weather that day. Winds were 5 to 10 knots, seas less than 2 feet, sunny. There were no thunderstorms. Third, China bullies its adversary, linking it to a variety of unconnected trade and economic issues while insisting it remain bilateral. Fourth, China states a historical claim that is unsupported by documentation, leaves out evidence, and ignores other narratives. Fifth, and increasingly problematic, the PLA Navy is always looming in the background, just over the horizon, ready for combat if any of China's adversaries are foolish enough to offer it. The PLA Navy is now active at sea throughout the South and East China Seas 365 days a year. Predictably, China's conduct is destabilizing the East Asia maritime environment. As we witness the concerns of China's neighbors reflected in their responses and interactions with the U.S. Pacific Fleet, it was like someone had flipped a diplomatic switch. Before that, in 2007, we weren't particularly popular in East Asia. We had trouble getting port calls for our ships or landing permission for our aircraft. Beijing's conduct at sea in the last few years has turned that around 180 degrees. East Asia now remembers why they like America. Let me be clear. Nobody wants another Cold War, with the U.S. leading an anti-China coalition and forcing every nation to take sides. But they definitely want us there and supporting them as they try to defend their rights. We now have more places that want our ships than we have ships to send them, and I have more invitations to meet with my counterparts in East Asia than our pre-continuous resolution impacted travel budget can afford. It feels good to be loved, but we don't need this kind of influence. We need a China that is a trusted guarantor of East Asian maritime security, not the mistrusted principal threat it has become. We need China to act like a great nation and a responsible stakeholder, but that's not the China I've watched every day for the past decade. One of our panel's questions, as Jackie mentioned, was what is the impact of PLA Navy modernization having on other countries in the Asia-Pacific region? And I would add, what does the rebalancing strategy mean in terms of U.S. involvement in territorial disputes in the South and East China Seas? My foreign naval counterparts answer this directly to me all the time. They want us to stand firmly up for international norms of peaceful discourse. Most of East Asia outside of China is enjoying the fruits of liberal democracy and prosperity in a world of law. Even autocratic Vietnam is prospering under this existing world order. They like it, and they don't want it encroached upon or taken away by a hegemonic China. They want us to be supportive of multilateralism without assertively leading it. They want us to be capable in the region without being inflammatory. They want us to be able to rely upon our word, our treaties, as well as our military strength, which has been the stabilizing force for the past 7 decades. In the simplest of terms, they want us there, on the high seas, protecting freedom of navigation and free access to markets. Thanks for your time.
That's terrific. Thanks, Jim. Chris?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Admiral, Colonel, thank you for your time this morning. I'd like to thank the Naval Institute and AFCEA for sponsoring this and for giving us the opportunity to come together and share our thoughts. Now, there's a lot of smart people on the stage. I'm not one of them. There are 3 PhDs, a captain, a fleet intelligence officer, and a Marine. So if you wonder what I'm doing here, I am too. The title of the conference is Pivot to the Pacific, and it has the follow-on question of what are the practical and global implications. First, I don't think we can discuss the Pacific without considering China and the United States. All regional issues have an intersection with the national interests of both countries. The panel question presented is the Chinese Navy, operational challenge or potential partner? This is the wrong question. Right? The right question would be something more like, does China, and by extension the Chinese Navy, want to be a challenge partner? Looking at strategy, right? In my opinion, the overall strategy of the People's Republic of China is something like action, U.S. counteraction, and then a PRC reaction. There are 2 elements to this. Right? First, China believes that trend lines are solid. They believe that China is rising and the United States is down. This is dangerous. Right? They want the United States to manage China's rise because they believe the United States is a stabilizing influence. However, they want to supplant the United States. These trend lines, if perceived by China, can lead to miscalculation and sustained higher tension. Britain and the United States had a similar grand strategy in the pre- and post-World War II era, and the United States created a liberal world order. As of the present, China doesn't seem to be interested in this system and prefers to return to the Middle Kingdom concept. China's exact policy is unknown. There are hints, but this is criminology, and more appropriately, this is reading the tea leaves. There's a lack of democracy, and this is a problem for the world. Right? We know that policy is centered in China. We also know its leaders are insulated. We know the Chinese Communist Party is insecure, and this is evidenced by their increasing turn to nationalism. The Chinese armed forces are increasingly confident, however, and Sun Tzu would show us that they believe that first you attack the enemy's strategies and plans, and then its armies, and then its cities. So we come to the question, is China a competitor or partner? China has to think seriously about how its increased power, or how it should use its increased power and for what purpose. China has benefited greatly from self-restraint. This is enshrined in the values that Deng Xiaoping gave the country in the late 70s and early 80s, so far as keeping a low profile and focusing on its peaceful development. China continues to contribute to the international public goods as its power grows. Strategic restraint and prudence in exercising its power will help ensure the peaceful rise of China. Let us turn to China's maritime policy. Toshi, Dr. Yoshihara to my right here, is a subject matter expert. His book, which I picked up yesterday, Red Star of the Pacific, is fantastic. I only had time to thumb through it last night, but it really goes a long way to explaining this maritime policy, and I wholeheartedly agree with this argument. China's maritime policy is Mahanian. Interesting. I read at a Naval Institute proceeding, and we have the Mahanian philosophy being espoused by the Chinese. China believes in hard power. Right? Part of this is because Chinese soft power is not exportable. You can't export the Confucian culture. Chinese values, anyone remember the Comintern and the Soviet Union? This doesn't sell well across the world. So China believes very firmly that by increasing its naval power, then it's able to translate into real power. The People's Liberation Army and the People's Liberation Army Navy may be getting too far ahead of their leaders, evidenced by the South China Sea and the Diaoyu. There's a potential here for some military adventurism. Given that it's a center-driven policy in a center-driven country, it's important to consider whether or not we look at things like the Scarborough Shoals, where you have Chinese fishermen, and right behind the Chinese fishermen, you have elements of the Nine Dragons. These are the various Chinese maritime agencies. But then in Overwatch, you have two Chinese frigates. So that level of coordination could be indicative of military adventurism, or it could be indicative of a specific tactical action. I go back to my other comment of Chinese action, U.S. counteraction, Chinese reaction. So what is U.S. strategy? Right? First and foremost, we're not in decline. We're at an inflection point. The United States of America remains the indispensable country. Just ask the Chinese. They very much want us in the region. They very much want us to be managing their own rise, but they want it more increasingly on their terms. With effective governance and policies, the 21st century will be America's Pacific century. It doesn't have to be China's Pacific century. Managing China's rise is a decision. China doesn't want the U.S. system of liberal world order. Those are institutions, democracy, and norms. So do we let the wolf amongst the sheep? Or more appropriately, do we presuppose that China is an enemy? Well, it's a competitor. It's not an enemy. So we need to recognize that and we need to be candid about it. The U.S. does not have a center-driven policy. Our policy is a mess. There is no grand strategy for the United States in the Pacific. The strategic dialogue, evidenced by the Treasury, Defense, and State, it's meaningful and effective, but it's a talking shop, not a strategy. The pivot to Asia, or the rebalancing as we're now gently polishing it, deserves consideration and it needs to be re-articulated. Secretary of State Clinton's article in Foreign Affairs last year went a long way to that effect, but strategy requires coordination of elements of the national power. That's the diplomatic, information, military, and economic. The Department of Defense does have a strategy. This is public knowledge as part of the national military strategy. But increasingly, it's going to be problematic, and that we're going to have a budget-driven strategy instead of a strategy-driven budget. Elements of that strategy are PACOM. The Pacific Command is highly professional, and it's the executor of our strategy. The purpose of a defense strategy is first to deter and react to attacks on the homeland. Second, to deter and react to attacks on allies and overseas interests. And third, respond to humanitarian crises in countries, regions, and areas contested for influence. Air-sea battle. The United States assignment of surface warfare combatants to Singapore, repositioning of Marines in Okinawa, Guam, and Australia, strategic rebalancing between Vietnam, Philippines, Myanmar, and India. These are all evidence of an emerging U.S. strategy. I think we also need to consider the Chinese neighborhood and the U.S. partnership in that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Toshi.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. Today, what I'd like to do is to make several points about China's maritime challenge, both in a conventional military sense, but also in the non-military domain, and then discuss what this implies for the United States and for its allies in the Pacific. First of all, the key operational challenge in China is really China's large family of anti-ship missiles from a sort of a high-end conventional perspective that can be launched from a variety of platforms, from land, from the air, at sea, and undersea. I have a Chinese textbook on fleet tactics sitting in my bookshelf, and it is sort of a Chinese version of Wayne Hughes' classic on fleet tactics. And what it talks about in one of the chapters is how the PLA Navy could conduct coordinated strikes with its arsenal of subsonic and supersonic missiles to penetrate enemy fleet defenses. There is much discussion in the literature about saturation and even supersaturation missile attacks against the enemy fleet. This is quite similar to the concept of the Battle of the First Salvo. Intriguingly, I came across a piece in a fairly reputable journal about overcoming the Arleigh Burke's defenses that included the combined use of sea-skimming missiles, high-altitude cruise missiles, and the anti-ship ballistic missile that's already been mentioned. What was surprising to me is when I looked at the date of the article, it was written in 2002, well before the frenzy that we hear in Washington now. So the Chinese have been thinking about combined uses of missiles and have been thinking very concretely about the tactical uses of the anti-ship ballistic missile for at least a decade. In fact, a Western analyst has already traced the literature of Chinese discussion of the anti-ship ballistic missile in the late 1990s. And so this is something that they've been thinking about. And I think what is interesting and the thing to watch, I think, in the future is right now what we have is essentially an anti-carrier fleet or an anti-carrier strategy. And there's now an emerging debate in China as to whether this is a mistake to invest so much in a top-heavy navy, essentially, that focuses essentially on sinking the enemy's carrier, but that over the long term what China needs to do is a much more balanced fleet. So I think the fact that the Chinese are even having this long-range view about what they need to build is something that I think we need to keep track of. Second, I think it's worth broadening China's challenge beyond the naval dimension, and it's already been mentioned several times, and that's China's use of non-military implements of sea power, and I think this really deserves more scrutiny. China has, in fact, employed the China Marine surveillance vessels in disputes with Vietnam, the Philippines, and Japan over the past 18 months. This probing strategy allows China to test the bottom lines of rival claimants. It has precluded, thus far, military escalation and third-party intervention, meaning the United States, while helping China to advance, possibly over the long term, a new normal in maritime Asia. From a research perspective, we need a better understanding of these civilian agencies. A sort of open-source reference book like Military Balance and Jane's for the non-naval balance in maritime Asia, I think, is much needed. And also the linkages between the civilian maritime law enforcement agencies and the Chinese Navy and their potential ability to coordinate at sea should also be better understood. Again, I have come across some very interesting Chinese literature that explicitly considers the Chinese Navy as a backstop to the Chinese marine surveillance. Third, let me now turn to the impact that this is having on Japan in particular. China's naval and non-naval activism is already inducing operational fatigue on the part of the Japan Coast Guard and the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. This, it seems, is part of China's strategy to gradually tire out Japan. Japanese scrambling to keep watch of naval and non-naval activities have had second and third order effects, cutting into their maintenance and training cycles, and this is a real concern for both services. But the larger challenge, I think, over the longer term is whether Japan can even keep up with the shift in the naval and non-naval balance all at once as China continues to modernize at a rapid clip. Finally, I think it's worth discussing U.S. and allied peacetime responses. And I want to emphasize, we can, in fact, be competitive in a peacetime setting. And part of the competitiveness can be derived from our leverage across the so-called First Island chain that stretches from Japan to the Philippines. Now, we like to talk about the tyranny of geography, but if the United States suffers from the tyranny of distance in the Pacific, then China suffers from its own kind of tyranny, and that's the tyranny of choke points. Chinese mariners cannot reach the high seas in any direction without passing through the channels and the narrow seas formed by the First Island chain. Chinese trans-Pacific commerce, for example, must pass through the Osumi and Miyako Straits. Chinese naval flotillas cannot avoid the watchful eye of Japanese forces when they make their way into the Pacific. And Chinese analysts have long exhibited deep anxieties about being closed off from the high seas. This fear, I believe, offers a framework for us to think, operate, and fight asymmetrically. We can turn the tables on the Chinese. If they want to deny us access, we can seek to deny the denier. We can make it potentially very costly for Chinese forces to access and use the waters bounded by the First Island chain if we chose to, alongside our allies. Now, some capabilities come to mind: offensive submarine warfare, offensive mine warfare, and shore-based maritime strike capabilities like truck-mounted anti-ship cruise missile units that can be surged to the littorals. Those types of assets can actually be quite effective. In terms of submarine warfare and mine warfare, that would exploit long-standing structural weaknesses in anti-submarine warfare and mine countermeasures of the People's Liberation Army. Land-based assets, if used imaginatively, could stretch China thin in terms of its battlefield awareness while forcing Chinese planners to divert offensive assets. If the Chinese choose to compete in these areas in peacetime, there would be high opportunity costs in terms of their investments. In terms of submarine warfare, we already enjoy a very powerful lead, one that we can ensure might be insurmountable if we grow the force. Mine warfare, however, is an area obviously that will need more work. We don't have any shore-based mobile anti-ship cruise missile units, as far as I know, but our allies could be enlisted in such areas where we lack comparative advantage. I think one other point is worth mentioning, and that is that our friends and allies occupy the first island chain. This is an advantage that I think we should not forget. Our allies all attach very high value to the real estate they occupy, and from which they can deploy their own versions of anti-access forces. The goal, it seems to me, is first to make the Chinese respond to some of our own initiatives instead of the other way around. In a longer-term peacetime competition, we want to impose costs on their modernization efforts and divert resources from their offensively oriented capabilities, in particular their arsenal of missiles. In crisis or wartime scenarios, we should be able to make the Chinese think twice about some of their more offensively and even preemptively oriented options at sea. And I believe that Chinese caution and restraint over the long term should shore up crisis stability and escalation control should deterrence fail. Thank you.
Wow. As I think about all the things I just heard, we've been treated to a range of issues that start at the strategic level, go down to the operational level, and in some cases down at the tactical level. But I want to seize on something that Chris suggested and then get a quick reaction from each of the panel members to it. I think I heard that this idea that the PLA may be acting in an independent way. I know in the media we are often treated to articles that tells us that the PLA is off the reservation. The PLA is a rogue element imposing its will upon a reluctant civilian party leadership. I was wondering how the panel reacts to that. PLA, rogue actor, roguish bureaucrat, or doing the bidding of the party?
I think the PLA remains a party army firmly under the control of the Chinese Communist Party elites, and all of the senior military officers on the Central Military Commission have party credentials, are part of the Central Committee. I think that this is a useful line for the Chinese to put out on occasions where, in the course of their probing, they go a step too far. But in a way, it's not that useful because to have the United States think that the PLA is behaving in a rogue way isn't very reassuring to us. I don't happen to believe that's the case, but I don't even think that it's an effective stratagem on the part of the party, which I think is trying to use it as a stratagem.
So let me ask you a question. So you're thinking that the PLA wants people to think that it's a rogue element?
I think that the Chinese Communist Party elites might find it useful at some points to be able to distance themselves from the behavior of the PLA, but that doesn't actually mean that the PLA is behaving independently or is a rogue operation. I don't believe that for a second.
Thanks. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I would agree with Jackie. I think the evidence is there. If they were a rogue agent in these events that occur in Scarborough or Senkakus or other areas, if it was truly a rogue agent, then there'd have to be some evidence to suggest that the center and the party leaders were reining them in, and we just don't see that. And I'd also say that I'm not sure the origins of the stratagem. It seems to be largely discussed in Western academic and other agency circles. It could be that it's slid under the door and track 1.5, behind the door dialogues, but you don't see a lot of writing in Chinese public press about it so much as it comes in through other venues. And
there is no daylight, frankly, between what the military is doing in terms of its exercising increasingly effective or at least presence missions in South China Sea, East China Sea, and what the party elites write about and believe in terms of China's rightful territorial claims and domains.
Now, Chris, do you have some thoughts on that?
One of the, and it could be either way. I tend to believe that the Army is firmly under control of the Central Military Commission. But when you look at the organization of the Chinese government, it is not, it's not a black box that we would like to make it be. It's not monolithic. One of the most illuminating things, I think, is the fall of Bo Xilai last year when we had the party premiere in Chongqing. Right before he was brought into custody, he started to call around to a lot of the PLA Division and Corps commanders, and these are his friends, fellow princelings. And what you saw in the aftermath of that was the senior leaders basically had to come out publicly and recommit an oath to the party and restate that the party was loyal, or the army was loyal to the party. What that underscores is that was a domestic discussion, and that there was a potential there, albeit small, conversation about a potential a coup or shielding this leader. I think the conversation about the 100 years of humiliation and suffering, and that's a very consistent theme through all of Chinese culture now, and it's one of those things that nationalism is able to stoke, the idea that the country needs to regain its full territorial sovereignty, and that there's absolutely no daylight between the armed forces and the party on that.
Yeah. Toshi, any views on that?
Sure. I think one way to think about it is not whether the PLA is a rogue element or not, but just the problems that's inherent to greater military autonomy. When the military is told to stay in the barracks to fight and win wars, they then have to have that kind of autonomy to engage in doctrinal developments. And I think my main concern is whether the options that are presented to the policymaker in Beijing in crisis or conflict could be highly escalatory, at least based on some of the available evidence from Chinese doctrinal writings. And I think the key question here is, in periods of high duress and high stress in crisis or conflict, whether the policymakers can say no. Again, this is not a situation unique to China. I mean, this is a civil military challenge that that U.S. presidents have faced when the military has presented possibly unpalatable options. Thankfully, because of the civil-military balance in our system, presidents have, in fact, often prudently said no to those options. So the question is that balance there rather than the PLA sort of running amok?
We have a competitive in some areas. On the other hand, there is the potential, perhaps, for some cooperation. So my question to the panelists is: are there any situations, conditions under which a more capable PLA Navy has the potential to be a partner in any sorts of U.S. endeavors?
Hope springs eternal. I mean, I agree with what Captain Fennell said, which is we don't want China to behave the way it's behaving. We would much prefer to see China behave as a regional or as a stakeholder and a supporter of the international order, and we would much prefer to see China undertaking missions that help defend the global commons out of a sense of great power responsibility. But instead, I think what we observe is China doing things that are like their anti-piracy missions when and only when those kinds of missions are useful to China and the military in terms of its preparation for more out-of-area deployments and power projection. They're getting very useful experience out of that. It doesn't seem to be that these missions are born out of a sense of responsibility for protecting the global commons. In many other situations, when the world community goes to China and asks for support, China says we're still a developing country, we can't afford it, we're not there yet. So I don't yet see evidence that China is performing functions that we would assume a global stakeholder would perform. And I think it's striking that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who represents the Foreign Affairs Ministry, not the Ministry of Defense, not the PLA, told Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at a regional meeting that there are great powers and there are small powers, or there are big powers and small powers, and that's just a fact. And that was in defense of China's efforts to intimidate countries in the South China Sea with which it has disputes. And so I think there again we have evidence that this is not just sort of an aggressive PLA phenomenon. This is a Chinese Communist Party elite problem that we have. This is the mindset. If even the Foreign Affairs Minister, who's supposed to represent a much more diplomatic, benign face of China, is saying that, it's like what Captain Fennell said: what's mine is mine, and the rest we're going to negotiate.
So just to throw something out as devil's advocate, so it's always struck me a factoid that China provides more blue helmet soldiers to United Nations Security Council peacekeeping operations than any other Security Council member. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I square in my own mind that factoid with some of the views that you've put out, which are not illegitimate, by the way. So we have, again, to deal with China is to deal with conflicting trends, contradictory behavior. It's on one end, it's on the other, it's all over. Let me get some other views on that.
Yeah, I would just say that that's part of the, as they develop and grow and recognize that they have, a global economy and they want to be a part of that, they are going to have to engage in a world war. And so the language that we're seeing, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, you don't hear that much anymore about getting involved in affairs around the world. They know that they have to, and so they are engaging. And so to say hope springs eternal, that is the hope that we have, which is to say, as they get out and they move about, that they have to interact with folks on the high seas. And so from the U.S. side, the Pacific Fleet side, we reach out through the Maritime Mutual Consultative Agreement and try to negotiate safety at sea. That's a prime concern of the fleet commander.
And that has not gone well.
It is a long journey. We also work with, and we will be working with the Chinese, hopefully, as we've invited them to Rim of the Pacific exercise for 2014. And so I know that the previous 7th Fleet commanders, current 7th Fleet commanders routinely encourage their ship CEOs to reach out and engage with communications on the high seas. And, a couple of years ago in the Impeccable incident, things are kind of nasty. And the rhetoric seems to be more nasty the closer we are to their coast. But when we're out in other areas, Index, for instance, they seem to be much more collegial when we just, have bridge-to-bridge communications.
That's interesting. Yeah, Chris, do you have any views on that?
I agree absolutely. The policing of the global commons is a U.S. mission, and right now the Chinese benefit from that. They only have to engage where they want to engage. And so when it comes to partnering, they're going to take a very narrow view of what's in their interest, and do they have the resources to commit.
So, well, that's again, once again, Chris, you're raising the interesting point. So the question is, do you want the Chinese police the global commons if they were capable of doing it?
As a partner, absolutely. I mean, especially the United States, as we move into, I'm going to use the word retrenchment, as we start to rescale our forces and reposition them appropriately. I mean, it'd be nice to have other countries who wanted to participate in the liberal world order the United States put together. And that, I think the key aspect of that is that the Chinese have to be a partner in the existing world order, not seek to impose their concept of a world order as an overlayer.
Okay, I have just one more question to throw at the panels, and I'd like to open it up to questions and answers. Let's just go to questions and answers. I can already see we have an audience that's anxious to get at our subject matter experts. Okay, sir.
In the late 90s, the Chinese brought a couple of ships into San Diego. Admiral He, I think, was the gentleman's name that brought them in. Two things stood out with their visit as we visited their ships. First of all, there was not an indication of any satellite capability, antennas on their ship, and there was lots of HF. That was one. Two is we had a joint band concert on the base, and so the 3rd Fleet and Airpac and Surfpac invited their sailors, and they came with families, and the kids are running around. We waited and waited until the Chinese came in, and their sailors, first time we saw them off the ship, were marched in, they marched down, they were stood, they all moved their cover at the same time, they all sat at the same time. Based on those two facts, how are the Chinese ships? Numbers do they have the command and control to coordinate these massive missile strikes and supersaturation today? I don't know. I mean, that's a long time ago, but have they made investments in that area as well? And secondly, how are their sailors? I mean, I compared our American sailors to those Chinese sailors, and if I was going to go to war, I would really, really much rather go to war with our sailors than those Chinese sailors I saw.
Anybody want to take that?
I'll take the.
Joji?
Go ahead.
Okay, Jim?
I'll just address have they invested? And I think, Admiral, it's clear that the Chinese have put a lot of investment in what we would call, the kind of warfare that we are fighting today. SATCOM, a lot of their ships have it. Not all of their ships, but more and more of their ships have SATCOM capability. They've put a lot of satellites in the sky. this last year. They're going to put more up this year. And so they understand that all these missiles that Toshi talked about, just the submarine, surface ships, aircraft that have, 100 to 200 nautical mile range, anti-ship cruise missiles, you got to have queuing to put those fires over the horizon. And so they're working on that. The level of proficiency at doing that, I think they're still way behind us in many ways. But in another way, they may have an advantage because we've evolved over 70 years, and we have, stovepipe combat support agencies, stovepipe services. They've kind of blown past all that, and so we think of things and we analyze them in our own lens. But we need to analyze them and do the research through the way they've developed. And so, when we talk about, well, does NGA and NSA fuse their information and get it down to the warfighter in a synchronized way that's, like this, it doesn't happen maybe. For them, they don't have those organizations, and they went right to, what is my goal, what is my end state, and let's build it. So are they 10 feet tall? No, but I think they are certainly know where they want to go, and they're building towards it. And we see them at sea, and we see them doing the kinds of things that you remember doing at sea with new ships and with new missiles. And their sailors, you're right, the sailors are a different culture, but we've talked to them for the last decade, in our mill-to-mill relations as a U.S. government to the Chinese government, and told them about the power of the NCO Corps and the power of chiefs. And so they've heard that message, and they're working towards it. And depending on where you measure in the PLA, whether it's 2nd Artillery, submarine force, regular surface force, each one of those forces has, I think, different and varying degrees of competency in the development of enlisted sailors.
Interesting to note, prior to 1998, 1999, the Chinese military did not have a corps of professional non-commissioned officers who could have full 30-year careers in any of the services. This is a new development for the Chinese military. There is a Coast Guard, I think a Coast Guard commander who's waiting to ask a question, and I am wondering if he is going to give us a different type of viewpoint on the relationship between the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, and the PLA Navy, or their civilian maritime counterparts. Sir?
Well, to answer your question, we do a lot of engagement with them, specifically through the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. Not so much working Navy to Navy, but with their more Coast Guard-like maritime services, trying to find those common interests, particularly international fisheries regulations, things of that nature. And I think those are strategically valuable interactions that we have with them. Interestingly enough, the Scarborough incident, the Philippine ship that was sent was the retired Coast Guard cutter Hamilton that used to be here in San Diego about 2 years ago. First, the panel is great. I love the candid discussion. The question I have is, as you look at the Impeccable incident and the Scarborough incident, the recurring theme in there where the international community says the solution's in UNCLOS, yet we don't ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty. And I wonder what the strategic impact of that failure to ratify that agreement when that's still the rules we expect everybody to play by, and how that impacts our credibility in the region with the partners.
I'm not a legal expert, but my sense from talking to other countries in the region is their concerns about China's behavior and China's assertions of its sovereignty claims wouldn't be addressed simply by our signing up to UNCLOS. I mean, they're very concerned about China's objections to our Navy ships doing routine patrols, and our signing up to UNCLOS wouldn't resolve the dispute we have with the Chinese over that interpretation of what an EEZ is or what UNCLOS requires. So I'm not sure that signing UNCLOS would take care of the sort of deeper strategic problem we have with the Chinese. And I think they do have a very different interpretation from us.
Anybody else on the panel want to? Yeah, Toshi?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that China is a signatory, but it takes exceptions to sort of the broader interpretations of the EEZ in ways that are counter to how other states interpret it, lending it sort of sovereign characteristics to what you can claim in the EEZ. So whether you're in or out, I don't think determines whether this conflict can be resolved between China and the United States. And I think what's very interesting is that when you speak to Chinese legal scholars about the EEZ, we were hoping that after, say, 5-6 years of dialogue, that we could socialize them into thinking the way we think about it from Western norms. But it appears that Chinese legal scholars continue to stick to this very exceptionalist interpretation of the EEZ. So I'm not really sure, whether we are in or out will actually help this, I think, much deeper strategic disagreement about China's prerogatives in maritime Asia.
So I guess just to wrap this one up, we have an interesting situation where the United States is not a formal signatory to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, yet we adhere to the majority accepted interpretations of its provisions. On the other hand, the People's Republic of China, which is a signatory to the UNCLOS, has a minority and in some cases problematic interpretation of what can be done in an exclusive economic zone. That's a great question. Thanks, Commander. Yeah, sir, we have a question over here.
Yes, listening to your informed remarks this morning, it comes to mind to me that there's a great opportunity here for miscalculation, both at the strategic level and even at the unit operation command level, because of misunderstanding of I'm going to do the bidding of my nation and so forth. My question is, how are things like the pivot to the Pacific playing in China? We've talked about how we're reacting to them, but how do they see that, what I read as an incursion, an aggressive act by the United States military, and does that language that we're using, in fact, increase the opportunity for these kind of strategic miscalculations?
I'll take a shot at that. In September, I attended the Shanghai International Maritime Security Conference. And I was there with another Marine officer, and the Chinese academics, some of them were plainclothes PLN intelligence officers, had lots of questions for us about what the pivot was and what it meant. They look at it in two terms. One is they see it as being bellicose. They think it is absolutely a challenge to them that we are seeking to contain China. And then the second is they'll say they don't know, but they'll take that in negative context as well. It's, what do you all mean? What does strategic competitor mean? What does pivot mean? What does rebalancing mean? And it's very difficult to translate those words into Chinese. So from the Chinese perspective, I mean, they very much see the United States taking a more aggressive approach to them. And to go back to the earlier comment, they believe that they're on the rise and we're on the decline. So there's a little bit of how dare you when we seek to reestablish ourselves.
I'd just add that Joe, that we call it the rebalance. The pivot's out in terms of the terminology, but this idea that terminology, pivot or rebalance, would somehow be the impetus for what China's doing is laughable. I mean, they're on a path. They have a strategic end state they want to get to, and they will use, whether we don't sign UNCLOS or we come up with some policy called rebalance, they'll use each one of those things to probe and prod at us in the diplomatic arena. I would say the concern that we have is their attitudes and the statements that they have and what that does to on-scene commanders and people flying fighter jets and patrol aircraft over the Senkakus, okay? Or what happens off of the fishing fields between China and Korea when Chinese fishermen club Korean Coast Guard men to death. Now, we're not saying that the Chinese leadership has told Chinese fishermen to kill Korean Coast Guard officers, but they have, okay? And so that's the concern we have.
And can I just add one thing, which is I think the problem with the term pivot, which we've moved away from, is that it implied that we had shifted away from the Pacific and that we were moving back in. And in fact, while obviously we were focused on events in the Middle East and Central Asia, we never left the Pacific. We've been there consistently since the end of World War II. And the other problem, I think, with even the rebalancing is it's not clear if we're really resourcing it. I mean, now we've talked the talk, but are we going to walk the walk? Sending some littoral combat ships to Singapore is great, and sending more Marines to Australia is great, but it's not really an answer to the changing regional balance that is provoked by China's buildup. So I think we need to think much harder about what we're going to do to resource the pivot and make it real, the rebalance, in addition to just talking about it. Because now we have people's hopes up, and the regional countries and partners are looking to see what we do.
We have time for two more questions, and the gentlemen are already at the mic. So, sir.
I'm Dick Mackey.
Admiral.
The comments on Scarborough Shoals are very interesting to me because I have dropped an untold number of live 500-pound bombs on those shoals to destroy shacks that the smugglers were building for transshipment points into the Philippines. Two things about China, two facts about China that I think are very important. One is face. I think the prime example of that one is when the EP-3 was taken down. The Chinese were holding that on Hainan. They weren't about to release it. Denny Blair got a hold of some tape, video, that was taken of the same pilot in the same airplane harassing an EP-3. Sent that to Joe Preer, who happened to be the ambassador. Joe showed it to the Chinese government and said, "Do you want to see this on CNN?" The next day they released the EP-3. The other one is time. I've enjoyed your comments of what's happened 10, 15 years ago. What was stated 10, 15 years ago is now starting to happen. We think of time in years, sometimes months. They think of time in generations. So the plan that they laid out a generation ago is the one that is now starting to come to fruition. China, I think most will agree, wants to become a superpower. I think they're well on their way to doing it, both economically and militarily. The question I have is, do they want to be a superpower equal to the United States or above the United States?
Unfortunately, when you look at Chinese history, there aren't a lot of models of stable balance of power Westphalian systems. I mean, when Chinese look at their own history, in periods where there have been multiple competing powers, we think of that as an equilibrium or something that's potentially stable. They think of that as very dangerous and unstable. In their own history, stability has been achieved when they've been ascendant. So that makes me concerned that their ultimate ambition is primacy or hegemony, and that's why they use that term so often. They call us the hegemon. We don't think of ourselves as a hegemon. We basically think of ourselves as a power with a lot of responsibilities in the international system, but also one that's signed up to the international system. And we think there's stability in balance. They don't. I don't think that that's the lesson that they learned from their own past or the historical record. And so I think that that's a problem, because it means that for China, peace and stability follow from their being atop a hierarchy with countries below them, subordinate and deferential.
Admiral, thanks for those comments. I was the lieutenant commander that got that videotape and passed it up, and
Wow.
I remember those times very clearly and vividly. And you bring up a good point, which is to say one way we can moderate and impact China's behavior is to expose their activities. And I've been long a proponent of talking about things that I see on a day-to-day basis that most of you can't see because of classification rules. But there's a lot of stuff that happens out in the maritime domain that really isn't derived from super sensitive sources. It's just things that happen at sea. Japanese press is very good about recording the actual facts so that researchers like Toshi and others, Jackie and the academics in America, can record that so we can have really substantive debate. But when the evidence isn't out there of what they're doing, we can't have that debate. In terms of their ultimate goals, they write a lot about national rejuvenation, restoration of China's rightful place. Well, we have to say, what does that mean? What did it mean? Where were they when they were back in their rightful place? And in their minds, their rightful place was they were the center of the universe, the middle kingdom connecting heaven and earth. And so it's not co-equal. They write about co-equal today. They talk about that today, but I am concerned and believe that their ultimate goal is to be restored and rejuvenated to their former glory. And that means they're the center of their universe. The universe in 1640 was largely in East Asia for them. The universe in 2013 or 2020, 2050 is a much different universe.
Toshi?
Yeah, if I could just add what Jim just said, which is that, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force has been doing an amazing service to the rest of us in terms of the scholars in the field, because they have made a very deliberate attempt to publicize many of these Chinese activities as they cut through the First Island chain. And they've essentially created a chronology of a series of activities that we can't find here in the United States. We can go to Japanese sources for it. So I think they're actually doing an incredible intellectual service for us in the research side. Now, as for what China wants to be, what's really interesting is that even among mainstream Chinese scholars, when they talk about Chinese grand strategy and what China wants to be when it becomes a major power, is that a constant refrain is that China was not present at the beginning. It did not form and create the order that it lives in now, and that somehow this current international global order is somehow unfair to China. And so even mainstream scholars say that when China becomes a genuine great power, when it comes on the scene, it will want to change those norms, adjust some of those rules to suit China's needs. Now, the question is, what rules are they talking about? And in that sense, I think how China looks at the EEZ is a very important test case in terms of China's longer-term intentions because, in my view, I think, some of the norms are indivisible. You can't take exception to a rule and expect that that won't have larger ramifications for the global order and system. And so I think we have to be very, very careful when we hear that kind of language from the Chinese, exactly what the Chinese mean when they mean they want to revise or change part of the global order and norms.
Clearly, I have failed to impose party discipline upon this panel. And so we're going to take one last question, and I apologize for this panel going over. So, sir, if you would.
I'll try to make the question brief. Just as a bias, I'm a Mearsheimer guy, so I think this entire conversation is irrelevant. They want to be a great power. We are a hegemon, and we're coming into conflict. But that bias aside, specifically for the panel, as we're doing all the budget stuff, there's kind of two schools of thought regarding the U.S. Are we going to stay forward engaged, or are we going to kind of retrench and do over-the-horizon engagement? And so for the panel, specifically for China, if we were to do over-the-horizon engagement, well, I guess it's a two-part question. Is it possible, and what would it look like? Thank you.
I'll jump on that. Being an FDNF sailor, I do not support retrenchment. We need to stay forward deployed, forward engaged. That's the best way to what we've done for the last 70 years to keep peace and stability in Asia. It's our presence. It's our non-intrusive presence. That's what's kept people assured that things wouldn't get out of hand. And if we try to think that we can manage that from Hawaii or here in San Diego, I think history's taught us that that won't work.
I think offshore balancers typically don't look at the sort of the operational problems with offshore balancing, and they tend to kind of gloss over that and say this grand strategy will work, so just follow suit. I think it's easy to get out, but I think it's hard to get back in. All of the sunk costs that we built in terms of our forward infrastructure may be changed so radically that we would not be able to go back in times of brewing crisis. So I think at the practical level, there are some real impediments to this notion that we can surge back into those regions of interest whenever there's a crisis or a potential for sort of a great power conflict.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I just wanted to add, I think those are two ideal types of forward deployed or retrenchment and only operating from over the horizon in an over the horizon kind of way. And obviously, my suspicion is that we will move and have a mix of capabilities, some forward deployed, which we need to keep, obviously, and some more over the horizon capabilities. And another piece of this, obviously, is how we work with regional partners, allies, friends, to develop their capabilities into a kind of regional architecture in which we operate, but they also operate to maintain stability and defend their interests.
Would you join me in thanking this remarkable group of specialists for a very lively discussion?